Hey guys, tonight we slip into a smoky, torchlit hall where laughter echoes off stone walls and the air is thick with the heavy perfume of roasted meats, spilled ale, and a faint whiff of something you really hope isn't what it smells like. A banquet is underway, platters are heaped high, and every guest looks thrilled except for you because you've seen what's on those plates. Some of it looks halfway edible, but most of it, let's just say your modern stomach might file an official complaint before dessert even arrives. And honestly, you probably won't survive this menu without some very creative excuses about why you're suddenly not hungry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing who's joining me on these strange little journeys. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer to the banquet table, the long oaken board creaking beneath dishes stacked higher than your head. Candles sputter in iron holders, dripping wax that looks disturbingly like melted cheese, and the nobles around you chatter excitedly about tonight's courses. The first thing you notice is the meat, so much meat. Wild boar haunches glisten with grease, geese are stuffed and roasted whole, and on the far side, something vaguely resembling a sheep's head stares back at you, mouth open in a permanent scream. You wonder if it's rude to cover it with a napkin, but what the nobles don't say out loud is that freshness was a luxury, even in castles. Without refrigeration, meat often lingered in storerooms far longer than modern health inspectors would allow. Salted, smoked, or pickled at was the only hope of keeping it safe, though safe is relative. Imagine your leftovers sitting in the fridge for a week, except without the fridge. That's basically what these feasts relied on. One roasted pheasant passes under your nose, feathers still clinging here and there, and you're not sure if that's a garnish or just laziness. Medieval cooks often served animals in their natural attire, meaning you could be carving meat while feathers, fur, or even the animal's claws reminded you exactly who you were eating. It was meant to impress, to show wealth and daring. But you can't help thinking it's more like a horror-themed dinner theater. Somewhere to your left, a platter of venison pie is sliced open. Steam bursts out, but the smell is complicated, rich, gamey, and underneath it, a sour tense that suggests the deer wasn't exactly fresh when it went into the pastry. Still, nobody flinches. People of the time were accustomed to stronger, funkier flavors. Historians still argue whether spices were mostly used to cover up spoilage or simply to flaunt wealth, but either way, you're quietly grateful you've packed a granola bar in your imagination. And let's not ignore the sauces. Thick, brown, and lumpy, they coat nearly every dish, turning roasts into slippery, mysterious puzzles. One bite might be sweetened with honey, the next spiked with vinegar so sharp it stings your nose. Cooks loved to experiment with mixtures that modern palates would call eccentric. Almond milk, wine, fish, sauce, sugar, and cloves in the same bowl. That's not a nightmare recipe. That's Tuesday in a medieval kitchen. If you're wondering whether food poisoning was common, well, congratulations, you guessed correctly. It was so normal that people had a whole vocabulary for stomach upsets. You can imagine nobles grumbling the morning after. Oh yes, the venison turned on me as casually as you'd complain about a Wi-Fi outage. There was even a belief that a little rot made meat easier to digest, which is either an early attempt at optimistic rebranding or just sheer denial. And while you sit here, forcing a smile as a servant ladles mystery stew into your bowl, you notice the table manners, or rather, the lack of them. Everyone eats with their fingers, tearing hunks of meat, licking their thumbs, and then diving straight back in. Forks are rare and considered vaguely suspicious, too dainty, too foreign. Knives double as both weapons and utensils. And your neighbor, he just used his sleeve as a napkin. You tell yourself to breathe through your mouth, gently, quietly, like someone meditating their way through a nightmare. You might think the poor had it worse. And they did, but don't underestimate how unsettling elite dining could be. The wealthy had access to exotic birds like swan or peacock, roasted and served with feathers reattached for drama. Picture a cooked bird, golden brown, but then some chef lovingly sticks the dazzling feathers back on before parading it through the hall. It's part dinner, part puppet show, part fever dream. No one blinks. You're the only one wondering if you've accidentally wandered into medieval performance art. One quirky tidbit: records show nobles occasionally dined on porpoise, especially on fast days when meat from land animals was forbidden. Yes, porpoise, as in the dolphin family. The church debated whether it counted as fish, and eventually shrugged and said, sure, why not? Imagine announcing to your guests, tonight's fish course is dolphin. That'll get the conversation flowing, of course. Not everything was revolting. Fresh fruit appeared in summer, warm bread smelled heavenly, and on rare occasions, dishes were genuinely delicious. But those were the exceptions. More often, feasts were about spectacle and status, not flavor. You weren't there to enjoy the food. You were there to admire how much of it the host could afford to waste. Food piled higher than anyone could eat, half destined to be donated, half destined to rot. By now, your imaginary stomach is tight with a mix of hunger and dread. The banquet is only on its first course, and already you're silently begging for a plain bowl of rice, or maybe just a glass of water. But don't worry, the night has plenty more dishes in store. You reach for your cup of ale, hoping it will wash away the taste. But as soon as it hits your tongue, you realize the drink might be as risky as the food. You tip the mug away from your lips, deciding that warm, sour ale is not the palate cleanser you were hoping for. Across the hall, a servant heaves in a wooden tub, sloshing something that immediately seizes your attention. The smell hits first sharp, fishy, like a tide pool left out in the sun. You realize the next course is swimming its way onto the table, though not in the lively, wriggling way you might hope. Fish in the Middle Ages was everywhere, especially because the church demanded meatless days, sometimes up to half the calendar year. That's a lot of Fridays spent staring at scales and bones. And since refrigeration was non-existent, preserving fish became an art form. Unfortunately, the art was less about flavor and more about brute force survival. Salt barrels, mud pits, and fermentation jars were the medieval versions of your freezer aisle. Imagine someone shoving a trout into a bucket of brine, leaving it for weeks, then plopping it straight onto your plate with a cheerful bon appetit. Your neighbor digs into a slab of something grayish, flaking at the edges. It's stockfish dried cod, so tough you practically need a hammer to crack it open. Cooks would soak it for days just to make it chewable. You poke it politely and wonder if gnawing on the banquet table itself might be easier. And then there's lamprey, a creature that looks more like a medieval weapon than a meal. Long, slimy, jawless, with a circular mouth full of teeth. Lampreys were actually considered a delicacy among kings. One English monarch supposedly died after eating too many, though historians still argue whether the fish was truly to blame or whether the king's own gluttony wrote the ending. Either way, when someone slides a lamprey pie in front of you, you consider feigning a fainting spell to escape. Not all fish was noble fare though. Down by the riverside, common folk made do with eels, carp, or whatever else they could catch. Eels in particular were so abundant in England that they were used as a form of rent payment. Yes, you could literally pay your landlord in slimy, wriggling eels. Try explaining that to your modern property manager. Sorry, the check is late, but here's a sack of eels. Back in the hall, servants pour something from clay jars into smaller bowls. It's garum, a fermented fish sauce borrowed from Roman tradition. Essentially, you take fish guts, let them rot in the sun until they liquefy, and voila, a prized seasoning. It clings to the air, a pungent perfume that insists you breathe it whether you want to or not. Modern scholars debate how widespread garum's use really was in Northern Europe, but tonight, your nose confirms that somebody, somewhere, is ladling it generously as you brave a cautious spoonful of fish stew. You realize the vegetables floating in it have disintegrated into mush, leaving only the slippery chunks of something that was once aquatic. You glance around and see that nobody else minds. They slurp happily, smacking lips, praising the sharpness of the broth. Your inner monologue screams, "This is the sharpness of ammonia." People, there's also the peculiar practice of burying fish in mud or sand to keep them fresh. The logic was that Earth stayed cool. So if you tucked your catch underground, you'd buy a few more days before it turned into a science experiment. Of course, digging your dinner out of the backyard sounds less like storage and more like treasure hunting. Except the treasure is a questionable carp. One quirky tidbit: monks sometimes devised elaborate loopholes to justify eating semi-aquatic creatures. Beavers, for example, were declared fish because their tails were scaly and spent time in water. So yes, on fasting days, chewing a beaver tail stew was technically acceptable. Somewhere, a monk surely smirked while spooning up his fish. You can't help but admire the creativity, even if your taste buds are terrified. The banquet rolls on, platters of herring, trout, and salmon making the rounds. Some are pickled, some are smoked, and a few look suspiciously like they've just been rehydrated after a long stint in a salt barrel. Each dish is a gamble. Do you bite and risk a tangy surprise, or do you pass and risk offending your host? The social stakes are high, but your stomach quietly whispers, "Choose offense." Servants circulate with knives, hacking fish into chunks while guests grab pieces with bare fingers. Bones splinter, scales stick to lips, and someone at the end of the table is loudly praising how ripe the fish tastes tonight. Ripe, not fresh, not tender ripe. You consider whether it's acceptable to crawl under the table and hide until dessert. Still, amid the questionable dishes, you notice flashes of ingenuity. Smoking fish over order would lend it a surprisingly pleasant aroma. Pickling in vinegar gives it a tang that, if you squint, almost resembles modern ceviche. And when salmon is caught fresh from a cold river and cooked the same day, even you have to admit it's tempting. These moments remind you that not everything on the medieval menu was punishment. Sometimes, it really was about survival mixed with a touch of artistry. But as the bowls empty and the air grows thick with fish oil and smoke, you sense the feast is far from over. The servants whisk away the remains, leaving only bones scattered across trenches. You lean back, hoping the next course might involve something simple, maybe bread or fruit. Instead, You catch sight of a steaming pastry being carried in, the crust golden, the smell alarming. Inside that flaky shell hides the next round of medieval surprises. The pastry lands before you with a heavy thud, the kind that makes the wooden table shiver. At first glance, it looks almost promising, a golden dome, edges crimped, steam seeping out of tiny holes poked on top. You lean closer, hoping for the comforting scent of apple or maybe spiced pear. Instead, the aroma that greets you is complicated. A wave of gamey meat mixed with something sour and strangely metallic. Welcome, my friend, to the medieval meat pie. You steady your spoon, yes. Sometimes spoons were the safer option here, and crack the crust. The steam rises like a genie from a lamp, except instead of granting wishes, this one smells like it's been sitting in the back of the pantry for a week too long. Your seatmate dives right in, chewing happily, but when you peer inside, the filling is a murky stew of shredded meat, fat herbs, and the occasional unidentifiable lump. You can't shake the suspicion that this pie is less farm-tootable and more whatever was left over in the kitchen, and you wouldn't be wrong. Pies were one of the most common medieval dishes precisely because they were perfect hiding spots. Didn't want guests to know you'd padded out the venison with scraps of rabbit or pigeon. Just bury it under pastry. Ran out of fresh meat and had to use yesterday's leftovers. Bake it in a pie. The crust, called a coffin, which is not a reassuring name, by the way, was usually thick, tough, and not always meant to be eaten. It was more like an edible Tupperware, a shell to hold the contents together and keep them from spoiling too quickly. Historians still argue whether the average diner ate the crust or tossed it aside. Some records suggest the poor happily gnawed on the hardened pastry after the nobles had scraped out the good bits. Others believe cooks occasionally enriched the dough with butter or eggs to make it palatable. Either way, when you take your first tentative bite, it feels like chewing a shingle, crunchy, bland, and destined to stick in your teeth like medieval cement. Inside the pie, the meats vary wildly. Pork was common, chicken too, but it wasn't unusual to stumble across goose, pigeon, or even tiny songbirds, all baked together in one glorious Frankenstein filling. Sometimes eggs were cracked in for good measure, making the center a custard-like mash of meat and cream. You tell yourself it's kind of like a rustic quiche, but your tongue insists it's more like a mistake that refuses to end. And then there were the surprises. Cooks loved to tuck in whole creatures, leaving their shapes intact beneath the crust. Slice too far to the left, and suddenly you've got a beak staring back at you, feathers singed but not fully plucked. One chronicler describes pies with live birds hidden inside, so that when the crust was opened, they'd flutter out in a dazzling display. Fun for the nobles, sure, but imagine being the guest who thought dinner was ready and instead got slapped in the face by a confused sparrow. Quirky as that sounds, these theatrical pies were more than pranks. They were status symbols. If your cook could pull off something bizarre and expensive, your reputation soared. Guests left whispering about the spectacle, even if they quietly prayed never to taste it again. And in truth, pies were one of the safest bets for disguising questionable ingredients. If the meat was edging toward ripe, a handful of cloves, cinnamon, or saffron could transform the smell, or at least distract from it long enough for everyone to get through dinner. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Some monks wrote grumpy commentaries about the decadence of pies, mocking nobles for caring more about spectacle than substance. Yet the trend persisted, because nothing says power like baking 30 pigeons into a single crust and calling it supper. You brave another bite, trying to focus on the pastry this time, but it's dense, dry, and has absorbed every ounce of fat from the filling. Your mouth feels coated, sticky, as if you've been eating wax candles instead of food. Across the table, though someone is humming happily, licking their fingers. Clearly, your modern palate isn't built for this. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists once uncovered pie crusts so tough they had survived centuries buried in the ground, still recognizable as bowls. Imagine your leftovers being so solid they could double as pottery. That's less food, more fossil. Still, there's a charm to the idea. Pies brought people together, filled bellies, and stretched ingredients further than a roast ever could. For peasants, a smaller, simpler version might mean survival through winter. For nobles, it meant showing off. For you, sitting nervously with a forkful halfway to your mouth, it means silently praying the next course involves something green, fresh, and not wrapped in a coffin, but the servants are already clearing the pie tins, scraping scraps into buckets, and heading back toward the kitchens. You rub your stomach, trying not to think about how much grease you've swallowed, when suddenly a new smell wafts in. Sour, milky, oddly comforting and unsettling at the same time. Looks like tonight, dairy is on the menu and, not always in the way you expect. The servants return, balancing wooden bowls filled with pale liquids and hunks of soft white curds. At first, you think it might be soup, but then the sour Thames hits your nose, and you realize you've just been handed medieval dairy. Milk, cheese, and everything that happened between them. It's about to be a creamy ride, though not necessarily in a good way. You dip a spoon into the bowl. The liquid is thin, watery, and smells faintly of barnyard. This is milk, but not the kind you'd pour over cereal. Medieval milk came straight from the animal cow, goat, or sheep and had a very short shelf life. Without refrigeration, it soured quickly, often within hours in warm weather. People rarely drank it fresh. Instead, they turned it into butter, buttermilk, curds, or cheese. Tonight, you're sampling something in the middle. A half-soured mixture that your host swears is good for the stomach. You take one sip, and your stomach immediately begs to disagree. Cheese, at least, had more staying power. Wheels of hard cheddar-like rounds could last months, even years, if stored properly. But don't imagine the tidy supermarket blocks you know today. Medieval cheese ranged from rock-solid bricks that could double as doorstops to gooey, oozing lumps that smelled like someone forgot to wash their boots. A platter of both kinds is passed your way. You politely cut a piece of the firm stuff, but your neighbor gleefully scoops the soft one, spreading it across bread with the enthusiasm of a child with finger paint. Historians still argue whether most people tolerated or even enjoyed the stronger, funkier cheeses. To modern palates, the stench might feel like punishment. Yet, in an era where preservation was everything, the smell was just part of the package. And, believe it or not, cheese had medicinal value too. Physicians prescribed it for ailments ranging from stomach complaints to bad dreams. Imagine your doctor handing you a wedge of smelly blue cheese and saying, "Eat this before bed, you'll sleep like a baby," comforting. Unless you're the baby who can't stop crying. There's also a more fringe tidbit. Some households believed cheese could reveal secrets. One folktale describes placing pieces of cheese under the pillows of potential thieves. Whoever had nightmares was declared guilty. Another tale insists that young women could dream of their future husbands if they ate a special curd mixture before bed. Forget dating apps. Medieval tinder was basically dairy-induced hallucinations. Butter makes an appearance too, but in many parts of Europe, it was considered peasant food. Nobles preferred oil imported from the Mediterranean, while butter was the spread of choice for farmers and villagers. That didn't stop creative cooks from whipping it into sauces or slathering it across bread so dark and heavy it needed all the softening it could get. As you nibble on a crust smeared with butter, you realize it's the closest thing to comfort food you've had all evening. Still, dairy had its dangers. Milk often carried bacteria, and without pasteurization, illness was a real risk. Monks recorded outbreaks of food poisoning traced back to spoiled curds, though of course they blamed the stars or the humours rather than invisible germs. One chronicle even warns against drinking milk after dark, claiming it spoils the mind. You glance into your bowl and wonder if that's an ancient way of saying lactose intolerance. Cheese-making itself was a messy but ingenious process. Rennetin enzyme from a calf's stomach was used to curdle the milk. Yes, that means cheese literally began in an animal's gut. You picture a monk explaining this to a wide-eyed apprentice. First, grab the stomach lining. Next, add milk. Then wait for the magic. And somehow, the result was edible. Sometimes delicious, sometimes terrifying. Always unpredictable. A particularly pungent wheel is set before you now. The rind cracked, the inside mottled with veins of blue. Your host calls it noble cheese, prized for its strength. You take a tiny bite, and your tongue burns with sharpness. Your nose fills with earthy Thames, and your throat insists this is closer to penicillin than food, which, funnily enough, isn't far from the truth. Certain moldy cheeses likely had mild antibiotic effects long before anyone knew the word antibiotic. Accidental science, wrapped in a rind. You glance around the table, noticing how casually people alternate between sips of ale and bites of sour cheese, unfazed by textures that make you twitch. A child gnaws happily on a hardened lump, while an elder dips soft curds into honey. You can't help but admire the adaptability people found joy in flavors you struggle to endure. And then there are the drinks. Posset, a mixture of hot milk curdled with ale or wine, makes the rounds. Sweetened with spices, it was thought to be both a dessert and a medicine, the medieval answer to hot cocoa. You lift a cup, inhale, and the sour-sweet scent nearly undoes you. Still, you sip, and the warmth slides down your throat, soothing in spite of itself. Maybe, just maybe, you could get used to this sif. You didn't know how it was made, but the respite doesn't last. As the bowls are cleared, servants roll in barrels and pitchers, frothy liquids spilling over the rims. The room cheers, mugs slam on tables, and you realize the evening is about to get louder, smellier, and considerably dry. Medieval ale is here, and your taste buds aren't ready for what passes as beer in this hall. The clatter of wooden mugs echoes across the hall as servants lug in foaming pitchers, pouring ale into every vessel within reach. The golden liquid glugs and splashes, fizzing with life, though not the kind of crisp carbonation you'd hope for. You watch as guests gulp it down eagerly, smacking their lips with satisfaction, and you cautiously raise your cup. One sip later, and you're convinced someone steeped a soggy leather boot in warm water, added a dash of yeast, and called it a day. Welcome to the world of medieval ale. You see, ale wasn't just a drink, it was survival. Water sources were often unsafe, teeming with bacteria and waste, so brewing became the everyday solution. The boiling process killed off many harmful microbes, and the alcohol added a layer of safety. Even children drank it, though usually in a weaker form called small beer. But don't picture craft brews with floral hops and precise fermentation. Hops weren't commonly used in much of Europe until later centuries, so early ale was often murky, flat, and unpredictably flavored. The taste varied wildly. Some batches came out sour, others bland, and some, well, let's just say the brewer probably shouldn't quit their day job. Ingredients depended on what was available: barley, oats, wheat, sometimes herbs like yarrow or heather to add bite. Imagine rolling dice with every sip. Will it taste earthy, grassy, or like someone spilled a candle into it? You never knew. Historians still argue whether most people genuinely enjoyed the taste or simply tolerated it as the safer option. Some records hint at pride in well-made brews, while others describe complaints of bitter off flavors. Either way, ale was everywhere, in monasteries, in taverns, even in households where women, known as alewives, brewed small batches for neighbors. You can almost picture an alley lined with barrels, each with a broom hanging outside to signal fresh ale for sale. It's charming, in theory. Less so when you remember sanitation wasn't exactly a strong suit. One quirky tidbit: some alewives were accused of witchcraft. Their brewing knowledge: mysterious herbs, bubbling cauldrons, pointy hats worn to stand out in markets, fed into stereotypes that later shaped our classic witch image. So next time you see a witch with her cauldron, think less spells and more questionable homebrew. Back at the banquet, mugs are being drained and refilled with reckless abandon. The nobles cheer as servants bring out stronger varieties, thick with yeast sediment that swirls around like snow in a globe. You stare at your drink, wondering if you should chew or sip it. The answer seems to be both. To your left, a man brags about a particularly potent brew that could knock out an ox. His flushed cheeks suggest he's already testing that theory. On your right, someone else grumbles that the ale has turned. You give your mug a sniff and realize the sour note isn't just intentional flavoring, it's spoilage. Still, nobody's stopping. When clean water is risky, even bad ale is better than none. The stronger the ale, the more it fueled celebrations, gossip, and occasional brawls. Taverns in medieval towns were lively hubs, filled with laughter, dice games, and the ever-present tampes of spilled drinks soaking into floorboards. Here, in the noble hall, the atmosphere is more polished but no less raucous. One guest pounds the table in rhythm, another breaks into song, and you're half expecting someone to fall backward off a bench any second now. You take another sip, and the aftertaste lingers stubbornly, like wet grain stuck between your teeth. Someone nearby boasts that their homebrew once tasted of honey, but yours leans closer to hay. Or maybe hay that's been rained on for a week. You glance toward the kitchen door and silently beg for bread, cheese, anything to chase this flavor away. And yet, in its own way, ale held communities together. It was fuel for laborers, refreshment for travelers, and comfort for those ending long days in cold cottages. Even kings had their favorite brews, commissioning barrels by the hundreds. Records show that some monasteries became famous for their brewing skills, turning what was once a survival necessity into an art form. You imagine a monk carefully tending his vat, whispering prayers over bubbling grain, unaware he's laying groundwork for future beer traditions. A servant plunks down a pitcher of spiced ale, brewed with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. The scent is actually pleasant, warming your nose before the liquid even touches your lips. You try a sip and almost sigh with relief. It's not great, but compared to the boot leather brew, it's practically champagne. You raise your mug politely, clinking with your neighbors, hoping this batch lasts until the meal is over, but no feast pauses for long. As mugs drain and laughter swells, you hear the clang of new pots arriving. The air fills with the scent of boiled vegetables, heavy and earthy, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes. You know what's next. A cauldron of greens cooked within an inch of their lives, waiting to challenge your tolerance once again. The cauldron lands with a dull slosh, steam rolling off it in thick clouds that smell faintly like swamp water. A servant ladles out portions into wooden bowls, and what hits the table is, well, it started life as vegetables, but somewhere in the cooking process they gave up their structure, their texture, and maybe their dignity. You stare down at a heap of wilted cabbage leaves, carrots boiled to pale orange mush, and turnips that have dissolved into ghostly lumps. This is medieval greens, though the word feels overly generous. Vegetables, when eaten fresh, could be bright and crisp, but the medieval kitchen rarely allowed them that luxury. The belief was that boiling food to oblivion made it safer and easier to digest. So pots bubbled for hours over open hearths, reducing cabbages, leeks, and onions into an indistinct sludge. You scoop a spoonful, and it slides off with a plop that reminds you less of stew and more of something scraped from the bottom of a pond. And yet, vegetables were essential for most people. Peasants relied on gardens full of beans, peas, cabbages, and root crops, though they rarely appeared at noble feasts except as fillers in stews. Meat was the centerpiece. Vegetables were the background chorus. Tonight, they serve as filler between courses, reminding you that not every dish can be swan or venison. You take a bite. The cabbage tastes watery, the onion flavor overwhelming everything else. It's bland and strong at the same time, a contradiction that makes your jaw ache. Across the table, someone sprinkles salt and grins as though they've unlocked a culinary miracle. You nod politely, though you're secretly wondering if you could trade your bowl for a crust of stale bread instead. Historians still argue whether medieval people avoided vegetables out of genuine dislike or because of medical theories of the time. According to the humoral system, certain foods were considered wet or cold, and too many vegetables might unbalance the body's humors. Doctors warned that raw greens could cause illness, so boiling was the safer, healthier choice, or at least the one less likely to be blamed if you spent the night groaning in bed. One quirky tidbit: some monasteries became famous for their vegetable gardens, growing rare herbs and greens with surprising care. Monks wrote detailed instructions for cultivating leeks and onions, treating them like prized crops. So, while nobles turned their noses up at greens, monks quietly perfected them behind cloister walls. You imagine a monk proudly biting into a freshly pulled carrot, while the lord across town choked down his 7th roast pheasant. Still, the banquet's vegetables aren't entirely hopeless. The kitchen has tried to liven them up with spices, ginger, pepper, even a hint of saffron. The colors are dulled from cooking, but at least the flavors don't taste like pure swamp. Somewhere in the mush, you detect a nutty sweetness from parsnips, and you cling to that like a life raft. But then comes the pea porridge, and your optimism crumbles. Thick, green, and sticky, it clings to the spoon in clumps. You try a bite, and it coats your tongue like wallpaper paste. Peas were one of the most common foods of the Middle Ages, cheap and filling, but not exactly thrilling. Boiled into mush, they were fuel, not flavor. The saying peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold wasn't just a nursery rhyme, it was a daily reality. You picture villagers eating the same pot for days, reheated each morning until the spoon practically stood upright in the bowl. And yet, these humble dishes kept people alive. In winters, when grain was scarce and meat too expensive, a pot of beans and turnips could stretch for days. Families gathered around steaming bowls, grateful for warmth, if not for taste. You take another bite, trying to channel that sense of gratitude, but your taste buds revolt. You chase it quickly with a gulp of ale, which unfortunately makes things worse. Across the hall, someone cracks a joke about green soup, and the table erupts in laughter. You realize humor was one of the few ways to endure endless bowls of mush. Maybe that's why medieval feasts piled on the spectacle, because if you had to eat boiled cabbage every day, you needed distraction. Your bowl empties slowly, each spoonful heavier than the last. You glance around, hoping for fruit or nuts to cleanse the palate, but instead the servants bring in trays of bread. At least it's solid food, you think, until the loaves hit the table with a weighty thud. Dark, coarse, and gritty, this is no fluffy baguette, it's medieval bread. And your gums are about to get a workout. The loaves arrive with a kind of dull authority, each one landing on the table like a stone dropped into mud. You lean forward, curious, and what you see is nothing like the soft, golden loaves of your modern bakery. These are dense, dark, and uneven, with crusts so hard they look like they could deflect arrows. You tap one experimentally and half expect it to ring like a bell. Welcome to the bread basket of the Middle Ages. Bread was the backbone of medieval diets, eaten by rich and poor alike, but not all bread was created equal. Nobles might enjoy fine white loaves made from sifted wheat flour, while peasants were left with maslin, a mixture of rye, barley, oats, and whatever else could be ground. The result was heavy, coarse, and often laced with gritty particles from the millstones. You tear off a piece, and it scrapes your gums like sandpaper. Congratulations, you're not just eating bread. You're getting free dental exfoliation. You chew slowly, trying to ignore the way tiny fragments crunch between your teeth. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's definitely laborious. Eating this bread is work. Across the table, people dunk their hunks into ale or stew to soften them, turning each bite into a spongy mass that slides down easier. You follow suit and discover it helps, though now your bread tastes like cabbage mush and sour beer. Not exactly a culinary upgrade, and yet bread was life. For peasants, it made up as much as 70 to 80% of their diet. A bad grain harvest meant hunger, famine, or worse. You glance at your chunk of gritty loaf, and suddenly it feels precious, even if your jaw is sore. Medieval people measured wealth and security not in gold coins, but in the number of loaves that could be baked. Historians still argue how often peasants truly enjoyed pure wheat bread. Some records suggest they almost never saw it, while others point to regional variations where wheat was more common. Either way, the gulf between mansard, the soft white loaves for the elite, and the dark, heavy bread for the poor was as wide as a moat. Bread wasn't just food, it was a social marker, a bite-sized symbol of status. One quirky tidbit: loaves sometimes doubled as plates. Called trenchers, these thick slabs of stale bread were piled with meats, sauces, and whatever else the meal offered. Afterward, they could be eaten, donated to the poor, or fed to animals. Imagine using your sandwich bread as a plate for curry, then handing it to someone else when you're done. Efficient, Yes, hygienic. Less so. Ui. The loaf again, noticing flecks of darker matter within the crumb. It could be seeds, or it could be unground husk, or maybe just a little dirt. Milling wasn't a clean process, and contamination with sand or insects wasn't unusual. Still, people ate what they had, grateful for any calories at all. In desperate times, bakers even mixed in ground beans, acorns, or chestnuts to stretch the flour further. That loaf in your hand could contain half a forest, and you wouldn't know until you chewed. Some breads, though, reached the edge of nightmare. Rye, if infected with a fungus called ergot, could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Entire villages suffered outbreaks, and the symptoms were so bizarre that some historians wonder if dancing plagues and witch panics were fueled by bad bread. Imagine waking up after dinner convinced the devil was in your kitchen, when really it was just your loaf's toxic bonus ingredient. You try another bite, this time of a lighter loaf brought for the nobles. The difference is striking, soft, airy, almost sweet. It melts on your tongue compared to the stone-like muslin. You glance at the peasants serving in the hall and realize they may never taste this softness, not once in their lives. Bread divides the room as clearly as the long wooden table, and yet, in the crackling hearthlight, bread also unites. Every hand reaches for it, every belly depends on it, every feast begins and ends with it. The loaves may vary, but the ritual is the same. You chew, you swallow, you survive another day. That was the quiet miracle of bread in a world where famine always lurked one bad harvest away. But just as you start to think bread might be the safest course of the night, a new scent drifts across the hall shop, exotic and almost suspiciously pleasant. Servants carry in small dishes filled with bright powders and tiny jars, their aromas cutting through the heavy air of cabbage, fish, and ale. Spices have arrived, rare and mysterious, and everyone leans forward with anticipation. The little jars are set carefully on the table, each one gleaming under candlelight like a treasure chest cracked open. A sprinkle of orange-red powder here, a dash of dark brown flakes, there's saffron, cinnamon, cloves, pepper. The smell alone is intoxicating, swirling, sweet, spicy, and pungent notes into the air. After hours of mushy vegetables and gritty bread, this is the first time your nose perks up with genuine interest. And yet, behind the excitement, there's a shadow of suspicion. Because in the Middle Ages, spices were not only luxuries, they were sometimes cover-ups, and sometimes outright scams. You lean closer as a servant spoons saffron threads into a sauce, turning it golden. The nobles murmur appreciatively, not just at the flavor, but at the display of wealth. Spices travel thousands of miles from Asia and Africa, carried by caravans and ships, changing hands so many times that their prices skyrocketed. A handful of peppercorns could be worth a laborer's week of wages. Imagine sprinkling that on your mashed peas. This wasn't just seasoning, it was edible currency. But here's the catch: spices also masked less than fresh food. A slab of venison on the edge of spoilage. Drown it in cloves and cinnamon, and suddenly it smells festive instead of funky. A fish that's gone a little ripe. Dust it with pepper, drizzle honey, and call it exotic. Historians still argue how much this covering up rot narrative is true, but tonight, as you watch a suspiciously shiny roast being slathered with a saffron sauce, you're not convinced it's entirely myth. One quirky tidbit: spice fraud was rampant. Unscrupulous merchants stretched expensive saffron with bits of dried marigold petals or mixed sawdust into ground cinnamon. Even peppercorns were faked by rolling tiny balls of clay and baking them black. Imagine paying a fortune for what amounts to flavored gravel. Authorities took it seriously. Records show spice cheats being fined, flogged, even executed for their tricks. That's how high the stakes were when your dinner relied on the real thing. You take a cautious bite of the saffron sauce. The flavor blooms warm and earthy on your tongue, unfamiliar but oddly pleasant. For a moment, you're almost impressed. Then the underlying meat flavor creeps back, sour and gamey. And you realize the saffron is less a star ingredient and more a perfume trying to disguise a corpse. You chew politely, nodding as if you enjoy it, while your inner voice whispers, "This spice deserves better company. Cinnamon is next." Sprinkled generously over a meat pie filling. To modern tastes, cinnamon belongs on desserts, but medieval cooks adored mixing sweet and savory. Cinnamon, lamb stew, ginger spiced chicken, even sugary fish sauces. It was all fair game. You taste a bite and find it confusing. Your tongue prepares for cake but gets mutton instead. The combination isn't bad exactly, but it's like hearing two songs played at once. Pepper, too, is everywhere. Nobles grind it into nearly every dish, flaunting it like edible jewelry. You sneeze after one bite, your eyes watering as though the pepper just picked a fight with your sinuses. Across the hall, people laugh and cheer, delighted by the sharp bite. You nod weakly, wiping your nose, wondering how much of this is enjoyment and how much is showing off. And then there's the most exotic of them all, sugar. Though technically not a spice, it was traded in similar ways and cost just as much. In the Middle Ages, sugar wasn't the everyday staple it is. Now was rare, crystalline gold. Tonight it's sprinkled into sauces, mixed into wine, even stirred into that ever-present cheese-curd mixture. You take a sip of spiced wine, and the sweetness surprises you, like mulled cider but richer, darker. For once, you almost approve. Still, even sugar had its dark side. Overuse could rot teeth faster than you can say medieval dentist, which, frankly, is a phrase nobody wants to say. Portraits of wealthy nobles sometimes reveal ruined smiles, blackened stumps hidden behind pursed lips. Imagine spending a fortune on spices, only to end up with gums that look like they've been through battle. The bowls of spices continue circulating, everyone dipping and sprinkling like modern diners at a condiment bar. You watch with a mix of fascination and skepticism, wondering how many of these flavors are genuine and how many are clever forgeries. A tiny jar of nutmeg makes the rounds, so precious it's guarded like treasure. One wrong sneeze and half a year's wages could scatter across the floor. But as the plates are cleared, you notice a new wave of anticipation among the guests. The spices have primed their palates, whetted their appetite for sweetness, and sure enough, servants soon reappear, balancing trays piled high with candied nuts, honey cakes, and sticky confections. Your stomach tightens. You've seen enough tonight to know that dessert here might not be the comfort you're hoping for. The trays glisten like treasure chests cracked open, and at first glance, dessert seems like a welcome reward for surviving the night's culinary gauntlet. Pyramids of candied nuts sparkle with a sticky sheen, platters of honey-drenched pastries ooze syrup onto the wooden boards, and jellied fruits quiver nervously under the torchlight. Your weary tongue perks up. Finally, something safe, something sweet. But as you pick up a slice of sticky cake, you realize medieval dessert has its own brand of danger, sometimes cloying, sometimes strange, and often more medicine than indulgence. The first bite of honey cake is overwhelming. The sweetness doesn't dance, it shouts. Thick layers of honey soak every crumb, and instead of balancing the heaviness of the bread and meat, it doubles down, coating your throat in syrup. Sugar, remember, is rare and expensive. For most, honey was the primary sweetener, used liberally at feasts to prove wealth. A noble could brag about his resources by serving desserts that practically glued jaws shut. You chew, swallow, and wonder how medieval dentists didn't run screaming from every banquet hall. Candied nuts come next almonds, hazelnuts, even pine nuts, each encased in glossy sugar shells. They crunch loudly, a festive sound against the murmur of conversation. But you also know the sugar wasn't refined to the snowy white crystals you're used to. It was darker, lumpier, sometimes carrying faint notes of ash or molasses. Every bite of these candied morsels is just a little burnt, a little earthy, like caramel made in a chimney. Historians still argue whether desserts like these were daily indulgences for nobles or reserved for the grandest occasions. Some records suggest sugar was so costly that it might only appear at weddings or royal banquets. Tonight, though it's flowing freely, spooned into everything from nuts to wine, it's a glittering performance, and you realize that every sticky bite is as much about display as about taste. One quirky tidbit: many medieval sweets doubled as medicine. Candied ginger soothed stomachaches, sugared violets freshened breath, and comfit-steeny sugar-coated seeds were thought to help digestion. So when a lord offered you a tray of sugary fennel seeds after dinner, he wasn't just being generous. He was prescribing you a cure for all that questionable venison and pea porridge. You pop a comfit into your mouth, crunch through the uneven sugar shell, and wonder if the placebo effect was stronger than the confection. Next comes a shimmering jelly, wobbling dramatically as it's placed before you. It isn't the brightly colored gelatin, you know it's made from boiled-down fish bladders or animal hooves, flavored with wine and spices, and sometimes tinted with natural dyes. You poke it gently, watching it quiver like a nervous guest at the feast. One spoonful in, and you taste faintly sweet wine underlined by a whisper of barnyard, desert, or broth. Hard to tell. You take another bite, hoping it will clarify, but it just deepens the mystery. And then there are the subtleties. These are not desserts in the usual sense, but elaborate sugar sculptures, castles, animals, even mythical beasts crafted from almond paste or sugar paste. Tonight, a servant parades in a dragon made of marzipan, its wings outstretched, its eyes glinting with candied jewels. The hall erupts in applause. You admire it, but when the knife slices in and a hunk of almond paste lands on your plate, you discover the reality is less magical. The texture is dense and gritty, the flavor overwhelming, like chewing sweetened clay. You nod along with the oohs and ahs, hiding the paste under your bread trench when no one is looking. Your sweet reprieve isn't done, though. Bowls of fruit to peripols, pears, figs, sometimes preserved in honey, sometimes dried until leathery. These are the safest bites of the night, still recognizable, still tasting of orchards and sunshine rather than kitchens and cauldrons. You bite into a dried fig, and for once, your palate sighs in relief. It's chewy, sweet, simple, but then you overhear someone boasting about figs stuffed with minced fish, and suddenly you put yours down very carefully. The sweet wine makes its return, heavily spiced and honeyed, filling goblets like liquid dessert. You sip slowly, savoring the warmth, until the aftertaste burns just a little too long. Was that cinnamon, or did someone go overboard with cloves? You can't decide, but at least it washes away the lingering cabbage and bread grit by now. Your stomach feels like a crowded tavern, every flavor jostling for space, none willing to give way. The feast has been a kaleidoscope of bizarre, overwhelming, and occasionally pleasant tastes, each one louder than the last. The sweets promised relief, but they've left you sticky-fingered and a little light-headed. Across the table, nobles laugh as they pick their teeth with knives. Children sneak candied nuts when their parents aren't looking, and servants sweep up the sticky wreckage of sugar sculptures. But as the noise fades and the torches burn lower, you notice servants slipping away to fetch something else. Not food this time, but vessels strange, steaming brews poured into goblets, mugs, and tiny cups. Coffee hasn't reached Europe yet, and tea is centuries away, so this is something different. Tonight, your feast ends not with dessert, but with the night's closing ritual. Bizarre medieval drinks that promise either comfort or calamity. The goblets arrive in a slow parade, their contents steaming, fizzing, or occasionally glowing with suspicious colors under the torchlight. You lean forward, bracing yourself, because if the food has been a gamble tonight, the drinks might be the final test of your courage. The first mug lands in front of you, and the smell rises like a punch to the nostril. Thick, yeasty, almost sour. It smells less like a refreshing beverage and more like bread dough that gave up on becoming bread. You take a cautious sip. The taste is heavy, cloudy, and raw, closer to liquid porridge than crisp lager. Medieval ale was rarely filtered, rarely aged, and often drunk within days of brewing. It's low in alcohol compared to modern beer, but it fills the stomach like a meal, which is probably why peasants drank it constantly. Even children sipped weak ale water wasn't always safe, after all. And as your tongue adjusts, you realize this might be the safest thing you've consumed all night. Congratulations, you're drinking liquefied bread, and somehow that's a relief. Wine follows, sloshed into silver cups with an almost careless hand. It glows deep red, heady with spice and honey. You take a sip, and it's sweeter than you expect, syrupy even, like someone dumped a spoonful of jam into a cup of vinegar. Medieval winemaking wasn't the refined art it is now. Sour barrels were common, and spicing them heavily with cinnamon, ginger, or pepper was the go-to solution. Historians still argue whether the nobles genuinely enjoyed these syrupy concoctions, or were simply masking bad vintages with sugar. Either way, your cup tastes more like dessert soup than wine. One quirky tidbit: some recipes called for wine mixed with egg yolks, breadcrumbs, or even fish glue to clarify it. Imagine your sommelier proudly serving you a Chardonnay filtered through carp. Tonight's wine, thankfully, seems egg-free, though you do wonder why your cup has a faintly gelatinous swirl. You decide not to investigate further. Then comes mead-fermented honey water, beloved by both peasants and nobles. It smells floral, sweet, inviting. You sip, and for once, your taste buds relax. It's smooth, warm, and comforting, like sipping sunshine trapped in a cup. But don't be fooled. Mead could pack a serious punch, and after a few goblets, even the most stoic knight might start reciting poetry to the fireplace. Across the hall, laughter grows louder, the music more chaotic, and you sense mead's influence spreading like wildfire. But the strangest drink of the night isn't ale, wine, or mead its posset. A mixture of hot milk, curdled with ale or wine, spiced with sugar and cinnamon, and served steaming in bowls. When the servant sets it before you, you hesitate. The surface looks foamy, but underneath, it's a swamp of floating curds and hot liquid. You take a sip, and your mouth floods with sweet, sour, and dairy all at once. Imagine a boozy custard that someone forgot to strain. Supposedly, posset was a nightcap, even used as medicine for colds. Right now, it feels more like culinary punishment disguised as comfort. And, if posset weren't odd enough, there's Hippocras, a spiced wine filtered through a special cloth called a Hippocrates sleeve. You taste it warm, sweet, heavy with ginger and suddenly feel like you're sipping liquid fruitcake. It's festive, you admit, though after the fish jelly desert, you're wary of any cloth filtering process. The cups keep refilling, the hall echoing with cheers and hiccups. Somewhere near the dais, a noble is trying to balance a candied swan's wing on his head, while servants discreetly mop up spilled ale. You cradle your drink, watching the blur of merriment unfold, and realize the drinks aren't just beverages, they're social glue. Every toast, every gulp, every shared jug brings the room closer together, smoothing over the questionable venison and the endless pea mush. Still, the downside is obvious. Teeth stained dark, stomachs sloshing, voices growing louder with each round. You take another sip of mead and feel warmth spread to your fingers, a pleasant hum settling behind your eyes. Maybe that's the secret of medieval feasting, not that the food was good, but that by the end, nobody cared. As the last jugs had passed around, you noticed the hall growing quieter. Not silent, never silent, but softer, more drowsy. Candles burn lower, embers glow in the hearth, and guests lean back on benches, bellies full, eyes heavy. The feast has reached its slow, inevitable close. You sit back, exhaling, your tongue still coated in honey and spices, your stomach wondering if it will forgive you tomorrow. And just when you think it's over, a servant clears his throat and announces that tomorrow's feast will feature a necessity from the far corners of the known world. Exotic, strange, even shocking delicacies, imported or imagined, that make boiled cabbage seem downright friendly. You shiver slightly, realizing tonight was only the rehearsal. Tomorrow you'll face the truly bizarre. The word exotic echoes through the hall like a promise and a threat. You picture the usual venison, porridge, and ale. And then your imagination leaps towards stranger, shore's cargo unloaded from distant ships, rumors of creatures half seen, recipes whispered in courts as both marvel and dare. Sure enough, the next course unveiled isn't a slab of beef or loaf of bread, but something so unusual it pulls every gaze in the room. A servant presents it like treasure, a roasted peacock, feathers carefully reattached after cooking, so that it looks as though it might take flight right off the platter, the colors shimmer iridescent blues and greens glinting in firelight, yet the smell rising from it is unmistakably poultry, somewhere between chicken and turkey. You take a tentative bite and discover that, beneath the showmanship, the flavor is tough, chewy, dry. The noble across from you nods solemnly, declaring it a marvel of cuisine, while discreetly reaching for more gravy. You realize quickly that the bird's purpose isn't pleasure, it's spectacle. Historians still argue whether peacock was genuinely eaten or merely paraded, but either way, tonight you've gnawed enough to confirm it belongs more in a garden than on a plate, and the peacock isn't alone in the look-at-me category. Soon after, servants wheel out a porcupine-shaped dish made by sticking almonds into a meatball mound until it bristles. Then a cockatrice appears, a Frankensteinian beast stitched together from half a pig and half a capon, roasted whole so it looks like an animal the natural world rejected. The guests clap, delighted, while you sit frozen, fork hovering, wondering if anyone asked the animal's opinions before this performance began. One quirky tidbit: some medieval banquets featured live animals hidden inside pies. Imagine cutting into what looks like an innocent crust, only for birds or rabbits to leap out, fluttering around the hall. It was entertainment disguised as dessert, equal parts magic trick and chaos generator. You half expect the next pie to screech when someone slices it open. Exotic didn't always mean theatrical, though it also meant imported. Strange fish from the Mediterranean, spices from India, fruits from the Middle East. Tonight, a tray of dried dates arrives, stuffed with minced pork and sprinkled with sugar. The combination is bizarrely rich, like a meat-filled candy bar. You chew slowly, trying to decide whether it's genius or madness, and land somewhere in between. But the strangest import of all might be the humble hedgehog. Yes, people really did serve them, though not always in the way you'd think. Recipes describe rolling ground meat into hedgehog shapes and covering them with pine nuts for spines. Others roasted actual hedgehogs, believing their meat medicinal. You stare at one on the table, its spiky shape unmistakably, and wonder which version you're about to face. A slice later, you find it's pork molded into hedgehog cosplay. Relief washes over you, though your appetite does not. Historians still argue whether such fantastical dishes were common or rare showpieces, but either way, they leave an impression. Tonight, they feel like theater more than dinner, a reminder that banquets were as much about awe as nourishment. If the nobles wanted to shock, they succeeded, and just when you think you've seen the peak of strangeness, the servants unveil something even more outlandish: a pie crust bulging like it's alive. The knife pierces, the lid lifts, and out flaps, not pigeons this time, but frogs, leaping wildly across the table. Screams, laughter, chaos. One lands squarely in your lap, slick and cold. You squeak yes, squeak, and everyone roars with amusement. The frogs are scooped back, the pie crust served, and somehow, after all that drama, the filling is just beef. You sigh, half relieved, half exasperated. Exotic, in the medieval mind, was often about bending reality, mixing creatures, disguising flavors, testing boundaries. Tonight's delicacies remind you that while modern chefs chase perfection of taste, medieval cooks chased astonishment. Did it taste good? Maybe. Did it make the hall gasp, laugh, and remember? Absolutely. Your belly is stretched, your jaw sore, your senses overwhelmed. And yet, as the last applause fades, another ritual begins. The end of the feast itself. Not just dessert, not just drink, but the winding down, the prayers, the leftovers, the quiet shuffle toward sleep. The hall's energy shifts, and you realize you're about to witness the strange and sometimes touching customs that closed a medieval banquet. The mood changes almost imperceptibly at first. The hall, once loud with toasts and laughter, begins to sag under its own weight. Candles sputter lower, their wax pooling across the trestle boards like tired rivers. The servants, who have been darting about all night like sparrows, now move with slower, steadier steps, gathering trenchers, scraping scraps into buckets, pouring the last dregs of ale. The feast is ending, but the ending carries its own peculiar flavor, equal parts ritual, relief, and, well, indigestion. A priest rises near the dais, clearing his throat. Everyone hushes, some with reverence, others with the glazed stares of people who have eaten one hedgehog-shaped meatball too many. He murmurs a prayer of thanks, giving credit to God for the abundance, the safety of the harvest, and perhaps even the mysterious miracle of surviving the cabbage mush. You bow your head, lips curling into the faintest smile. Gratitude, after what you've endured, feels almost comically appropriate. Then comes the business of leftovers. The nobles don't take them home in neat little foil boxes, of course. Instead, what remains is divided. Some goes to the servants, some to the poor gathered outside the hall, and some to the castle dogs, who have been patiently drooling in the shadows all evening. You watch platters carried out the back door, handed to beggars waiting in the chill night air. For all the spectacle inside, the feast ends with a reminder of hunger outside. One quirky tidbit: in some courts, the poor were allowed to eat directly from the discarded trenchers, those stale slabs of bread once used as plates. It was charity, yes, but also another example of food's strange double-purpose status inside, survival outside. Historians still argue how common this redistribution was. Was it genuine generosity or carefully staged display? Tonight, as you see a barefoot child clutching a loaf half covered in grease, you realize it was probably both. Feasts weren't only about excess. They were about power, and power was shown as much by giving scraps as by displaying peacocks. Back at the table, the nobles lean back, some picking their teeth with knives, others dabbing their lips with embroidered cloths. A few already snore softly against the benches, victims of too much mead and too little moderation. The air grows thick and sleepy, a mixture of wood smoke, spilled ale, and faint spice. You feel it, to the heaviness in your belly, the warm buzz behind your eyes, the subtle ache in your jaw from all that chewing. The servants return one last time, this time carrying bowls of water for hand washing. You dip your fingers in the water, cool and scented faintly with herbs, wiping away the honey, grease, and crumbs that cling stubbornly to your skin. It feels almost ceremonial, as if the act isn't just about cleanliness, but about drawing a line under the night. The feast is done. The slate is wiped clean, and then comes the final drink. Not ale, not wine, not posset, but a simple herbal infusion, something gentle, calming, meant to soothe after the storm. You sip the warm liquid, tasting mint and chamomile, and for the first time all evening, your tongue isn't confused. It's simple, it's soft, it's peace in a cup. You close your eyes, exhaling, the noise of the hall dimming into a background hum. A few stragglers remain, telling stories by the fire, tales of hunts, of battles, of saints and monsters. One guest launches into a joke about the pea porridge still standing upright in its pot, and the group bursts into weary laughter. Even in the Middle Ages, humor was the last course. You chuckle too, the sound low and drowsy. The torches are snuffed one by one. The hall falls into shadow, broken only by the glow of embers. You stand, stretching, your body heavy but strangely content. It has been bizarre, overwhelming, sometimes revolting, but also strangely human. Every dish told a story of survival, of status, of imagination stretched beyond taste. As you shuffle toward the exit, you glance back at the long tables, littered with crumbs, bones, and overturned cups. Tomorrow they'll be cleared, polished, reset. Another feast will come, another round of cabbage mush, swan pies, and wine that tastes suspiciously like vinegar. But for now, the night closes like a book, its pages sticky with honey and inked with laughter. You step into the cool night air, stars pricking the sky above the dark silhouette of the castle. Your stomach grumbles, uncertain whether to thank you or curse you, but your mind is already softening, slipping towards sleep. After all, the feast is over, and your journey through medieval strangeness has earned its quiet conclusion. The castle courtyard greets you with a breath of cold night air, sharp enough to cut through the fog of mead and honey still clinging to your senses. The torches flicker, casting jittery light across the stone walls, and the last echoes of laughter from the hall fade into the stillness. You pull your cloak tighter well in your imagination, since in reality you've been trudging through this medieval feast without proper medieval gear, and feel your belly groan as though it, too, is protesting the evening's menu. But the night isn't quite done with you yet. Out here, away from the heat of the hall, you notice shadows moving near the gate, servants carrying barrels, baskets, and even pails of slop towards storage or stables. What isn't eaten by nobles or servants finds a second life. The bones go to the dogs, the stale bread to pigs, the spoiled bits to compost heaps. Nothing is wasted, because nothing can be wasted. You realize medieval food culture wasn't only about what was served, but about what survived after the feast. And here's the ironic twist. The scraps might sometimes be safer than the feast itself. A crust of plain muslin bread, a handful of boiled beans, or a spoonful of yesterday's porridge might lack glamour, but at least it wouldn't arrive dressed up as a hedgehog. You chuckle quietly at the thought of peasants outside the castle, wall-nibbling discarded trenchers with more peace of mind than the noble gnawing on a saffron-lacquered swan wing inside. Historians still argue how widespread food poisoning was at these events. Was it rare thanks to robust stomachs, or common enough that banquet belly was an expected hazard? Judging by the way your gut is currently twisting, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. One quirky tidbit: chroniclers occasionally mention lords dying after banquets, their deaths chalked up to bad humors or divine judgment. In reality, it might have just been a badly stored fish pie. Imagine having your legacy remembered not for battles won, but for being undone by seafood. You pause near a stable where a servant tips slop into a trough. Pigs snort happily, rooting through leftovers. You recognize the same cabbage mush, the same gritty bread, now repurposed. It's humbling to realize how thin the line was between feast food and animal feed. In fact, medieval cookbooks sometimes blurred it deliberately, describing how to fatten livestock with the very same ingredients used to stuff pies. You think back to the posset, curdled milk spiked with ale, and wonder if the pigs might have preferred it to you. The moon glows high, silvering the rooftops, and the courtyard begins to quiet. A lone minstrel hums a tune, packing away his lute after hours of playing above the clatter of trenchers. His melody drifts soft and mournful, as if echoing the weariness of full bellies and heavy heads. You lean against a wall, letting the sound wash over you. The feast has ended, but its echoes linger in song, in scraps, in the faint perfume of saffron that clings stubbornly to your clothes. You reflect on what you've seen: vegetables boiled into mush, bread gritty with stone dust, meats disguised as mythical beasts, spices both dazzling and deceptive, desserts sticky enough to glue jaws shut, drinks that blurred the line between beverage and porridge. It wasn't just a meal, it was theatre, ritual, survival, and sometimes punishment. A medieval feast was never about comfort. It was about spectacle, community, and a little bit of showing off. And yet, as bizarre as it all felt, there's a strange coziness to the memory now that you're outside. Maybe it's the ale humming in your bloodstream, or the cool night calming your stomach. Maybe it's the simple reassurance that, despite the oddities, people gathered, laughed, and shared in the same basic rhythms of eating and resting that you know today. Human at the core, even when the menu included hedgehog, imposters, and frog-filled pies. You tilt your head back, looking at the stars pricked bright against the velvet sky. The air is cold, clean, free of cabbage, steam, and honey smoke. It's a reminder that the world outside the banquet is always simpler, always steadier. Tomorrow will bring new strangeness, new flavors, new discomforts, but tonight the feast is behind you. You're full, you're tired, and you're ready to slip into sleep with the memory of the hall's chaos fading into a hum. Like a story half remembered from a dream, the courtyard grows quieter with every passing minute, until the only sounds are the muffled snorts of the pigs rooting through scraps and the shuffle of boots as the last servants retreat to their quarters. You take a slow breath, cool air filling your lungs, and feel the weight of the evening settle across your shoulders like a heavy cloak. The feast has ended, the torches burn low, and you sense that this is the moment when the castle itself exhales, loosening after hours of spectacle. Yet even in this hush, the oddities of the night linger. Your tongue still carries traces of saffron and grease, your fingertips faintly sticky despite the herb-scented washing bowl. Somewhere deep in your stomach, the cabbage mush is waging a stubborn rebellion. You smile, Riley's survival of the feast feels like its own sort of victory. A servant passes, carrying a bundle of trenchers, to stale even for the poor. They'll be dried and ground into animal feed or compost. You watch them disappear into the dark and realize how circular this whole system was. Bread became a plate, became a donation, became fodder, became new food again. Nothing wasted, everything recycled. Medieval sustainability wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. One quirky tidbit: some monasteries had rules about never throwing food away, even scraps. Instead, monks sorted leftovers into neat categories: one for the poor, one for livestock, one for brewing experiments. Picture a solemn brother deciding whether a half-gnawed swan wing belongs in the charity basket or the pig pen. It's oddly comforting, this careful tidiness in a world otherwise filled with chaos. Historians still argue whether such recycling was common practice everywhere, or just in particularly organized communities. But standing here, after witnessing the sheer mountain of food consumed and discarded tonight, you're convinced that some system had to exist. Otherwise, castles would drown in their own leftovers. The night wind nudges you toward the edge of the courtyard, where a small group huddles around a dying fire. Their servants, their duties finished, sharing their own meal. You peer closer. It's not gilded pies or hedgehog-shaped pork. It's a pot of pottage, thick with barley, turnips, and a hint of onion. They pass bowls, dipping bread, slurping with quiet contentment. Watching them, you feel an unexpected pang of envy. Their food might lack spectacle, but it has warmth, simplicity, comfort. No frogs will leap from their bowls. No feathers need reattaching after roasting. Just hot, filling honest food. And suddenly you realize, this humble pottage is probably what most medieval people ate most of the time. The feasts were the exception, the spectacle. The real story of medieval eating wasn't gilded peacocks, but slow-simmered stews. Shared bowls, survival food that kept bodies moving through long winters. The servant's meal is less disgusting, perhaps less memorable, but far more human. Your body sags with fatigue, eyelids growing heavy. The night's journey has wound from mushy cabbages to gilded showpieces, from frog pies to honey traps, from vinegar wine to medicinal brews. You've seen what nobles flaunted, what peasants endured, what scholars still puzzle over centuries later. And now, as the embers glow low, you sense it's time to let the story ease into stillness. The castle towers above you, silent now, its stones holding the memory of countless feasts, just like this one night's of noise, of spectacle, of too much food and too little sense. Tomorrow, life will return to its usual rhythm. Bread, ale, porridge, toil. But tonight's strange theatre will live on in your imagination. Lingering like spice on the tongue, you close your eyes, the cool night brushing your face. The last notes of the minstrel's lute echoing faintly in your ears. You've wandered the halls of medieval dining, braved its oddities, laughed at its absurdities, and somehow emerged, belly aching but spirit steady. And now, like the castle itself, you're ready to fall into rest. The embers in the courtyard fire dim to a soft glow, casting the stones in a dusky amber haze. You linger, reluctant to leave, as though the strange parade of dishes, smells, and sounds still has one last secret to whisper. Your body is heavy, belly stretched and weary, yet your mind floats drifting through memories of the night's table, weaving them together into something almost dreamlike. It strikes you that medieval dining wasn't just about food. It was performance, ritual, and identity all bound together. Every trench of mush, every gilded swan, every oddly spiced pie carried a message. Who you were, what you could afford, how far you'd traveled in your imagination, if not your feet. In a world where daily survival was harsh, meals were stage plays. You weren't only eating, you were proving, but as you replay the courses in your head, certain details rise like little stars against the darker canvas. The cabbage mush, humble yet strangely stubborn. The gritty bread, an everyday hazard, turned into sustenance. The saffron, expensive enough to equal gold by weight, used to dye tongues as much as to flavor them. The honey thick, sticky, determined to cling to fingers long after sweetness faded. And, of course, the frogs leaping from pies. A sight too absurd not to replay whenever you need a laugh. One quirky tidbit you can't shake. Some medieval hosts, desperate to impress, had entire meals sculpted into edible castles. Walls of pastry, towers of sugar, battlements of bread. Imagine soaring into a buttered drawbridge just to scoop out some stew. It sounds like a joke, but chronicles insist it happened. You glance back at the castle looming over you now and smirk. Maybe tonight's fortress had a miniature pastry twin. Inside at some forgotten banquet, historians still argue how often such wild creations truly appeared. Were they once-in-a-lifetime spectacles, or were the wealthy so determined to outshine one another that these marvels became commonplace? You suspect truth lies somewhere in the middle, rare enough to astonish, but frequent enough to be remembered in song and story. Your legs carry you slowly toward the gate, each step dragging with fatigue. The night is cool and quiet now, broken only by the rustle of straw as animals settle into slumber. Somewhere a dog barks, sharp and short, then curls back into silence. You think of the trenches given to the poor, the bones tossed to dogs, the scraps fed to pigs, and it all circles back. no part of this feast truly ended at the table. Even in extravagance, the medieval world was frugal by necessity. You pause once more, tilting your head back. Above you, the stars burn steady, older than any banquet, older than the feasts of kings and queens who believed themselves eternal. Against that vast sky, the memory of cabbage mush seems almost comic, but also tender a reminder that even in their pomp, people of the past were simply trying to fill their bellies, tell their stories, and keep the night at bay. And now, finally, you feel the weight of sleep pressing harder than any trench of bread. Your eyelids flutter, your breath slows, and the castle blurs in your vision. The story has wound its way from steaming pots to gilded birds to quiet embers, and you've walked each step of it. What's left now is to rest, to let the images drift and soften like candle flames flickering into dark dot. So you settle yourself, body sinking, mind folding gently into itself. The feast is over. The night is still, and you, weary traveller through the world of medieval oddities, are ready to surrender to the simplest course of all. Silence. The silence of the castle night wraps around you like a heavy wool blanket, muffling every stray noise until even the distant hoot of an owl feels like it belongs inside a dream. Your body is slow, breath deepening, but your thoughts still wander lazily over the long, strange table you've just left behind. It's funny, after all the gilded birds and frog-filled pies, what lingers strongest isn't taste but texture. The rough chew of stone-dusted bread, the slick cling of honey, the rubbery resistance of a roasted swan wing. These are the things your tongue remembers long after flavor fades, and yet, even in their oddity, there's something oddly comforting about them. You realize that disgusting or delightful, all those dishes carried one truth: they kept people alive. They spoke of resourcefulness, of creativity under constraint. If cabbage mush was dreary, it was also dependable. If trenchers turned stale and hard, they were still transformed into fodder, fuel, or gift. The medieval world may not have dined on comfort food in your sense of the word, but they found comfort in knowing nothing went to waste. One quirky tidbit drifts into your mind as you hover on the edge of sleep. Some records mention cooks being punished when a feast went a-not for bad taste. But for embarrassment, if the swan collapsed before reaching the table, or if the pie failed to unleash its fluttering surprise, the cook might lose wages or even endure public scolding. Imagine your paycheck depending on whether pigeons made a dramatic enough entrance. You chuckle softly, the sound half muffled against the wool of your imagined cloak. Historians still argue how much of medieval dining was practical necessity versus deliberate theatre. Were the strange flavors accidents of preservation or conscious efforts to dazzle? Perhaps it was both. Salted fish was a survival tactic, yes, but saffron-dyed porridge was a declaration. Together, they made the medieval meal a curious blend of survival and spectacle. The night sky stretches infinite above you, each star sharp against the dark. You picture countless feasts that unfolded under this same canopy, peasants spooning pottage by the fire, nobles gnawing on extravagant birds, monks silently chewing in refectories where only prayers spoke. 1,000 different tables, all beneath the same moon. The thought warms you, knitting the centuries together with quiet threads. Your body shifts, searching instinctively for the most comfortable posture, though there's no feather mattress here, just stone, straw, or the suggestion of them in your imagination. But oddly, the discomfort soothes you. You've walked through sticky, chewy, greasy, and gritty courses. A little roughness under your side feels like part of the story. The breeze sighs through the courtyard, carrying with it the faintest trace of ash and herbs. You close your eyes, and in the darkness, the images of the feast replay one last time, but softer now, blurred like candlelight fading, the porridge bowl steaming, the trenchers stacked, the swans' feathers shimmering, the pie bursting into chaos, the priest bowing his head over scraps. Each moment folds neatly into the next, like pages of a book slowly closing dot, and with that closing comes the gentle reassurance you've been waiting for. You've survived the most disgusting dishes, you've endured the strangest concoctions, and you've learned that even the most outlandish feasts end the same way, in stillness, in sleep, in the quiet turning of another day. The medieval world may feel distant, bizarre, even a little revolting at times, but here, in the hush of night, it feels human, so you let your thoughts unravel, each one slower than the last, until even the frogs, the hedgehogs, the gilded birds, and the cabbage mush melt into silence. The feast has ended. The hall has dimmed, and you, weary guest, can drift at last into the gentlest course of all dreams. The castle walls glow pale in the moonlight as you take another breath, your body slowing, but the story tugging you gently onward. You think you've seen every strange dish medieval kitchens could throw at you, but no. One last course waits, not of food itself, but of the beliefs tied to it. Because in the Middle Ages, what you ate wasn't only about survival or spectacle, it was about medicine, morals, even the stars in the sky. Take humoral theory, for instance. Medieval doctors believed your body was ruled by IV fluids, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every food was thought to push those humors one way or another. Too much beef might make you choleric, too much fish might dampen your spirits, and too many cucumbers could make you well soggy inside. You imagine a doctor wagging his finger at your cabbage mush, warning that it might flood your body with phlegm. And yet, people trusted these rules as deeply as you trust your nutrition labels today. One quirky tidbit: some believed roasted owl cured gout, while powdered boar's tooth mixed with wine-soothed fevers. Others swore eating hare made you timid, or that wolf meat gave you courage. Whether these ideas came from observation, imagination, or pure wishful thinking, no one can say. Historians still argue whether humoral diets genuinely improved health or simply offered a placebo effect wrapped in superstition. Food was also bound to religion. Fasting days filled the calendar, banning meat, eggs, and dairy, leaving fish as the main substitute. That's why so many strange fish pies cropped up, often spiced and disguised to taste like other meats. To break the fast improperly was not just bad manners. It was a sin. You picture nobles sneaking bits of chicken into fish stews, hoping the priest wouldn't notice. Astrology, too, crept onto the plate. Some texts advised eating certain foods only when the moon was in the right house of the zodiac. Bread baked under Virgo might rise better, they claimed, while milk soured quickly if churned beneath Scorpio. Imagine planning dinner around your horoscope. You chuckle softly, realizing your own modern world still keeps echoes of this. How many people read lucky foods in lifestyle magazines today? And then there were taboos. Foods forbidden not by scarcity, but by symbolism. Horses were rarely eaten, not because they lacked meat, but because they carried status and labor. Cats and dogs, too, were mostly off limits, though famine sometimes bent the rules. You think of your own pets, grateful you're spared that particular historical desperation. The night air presses cool against your face as you realize these beliefs wove food into every corner of life. To eat was to balance body and soul, to please God, to honor the stars. Every bite carried weight beyond taste. The swan on the table wasn't just flesh, it was medicine, prayer, and performance all in one. Your thoughts drift heavier now, the humoral fluids and fasting rules swirling like mist. Even the strangest dishes, once so sharp in memory, blur into symbols: survival, faith, imagination. The feast becomes less about what it was, and more about what it meant. Your steps slow as you imagine the kitchens behind the grand hall, shadows flickering across stone walls where pots and cauldrons bubble with purpose and secrecy. The cooks, often nameless, worked tirelessly, juggling meats, grains, spices, and superstition. Some stirred cauldrons of fish stew while reciting prayers. Others measured herbs with an eye toward humors or planets. You realize these meals weren't just about feeding bellies. They were a kind of choreography, a dance of flavor, symbolism, and power. Consider the role of the kitchen servant, often overlooked but critical. They peeled, chopped, and stirred for hours, sometimes tasting the strange concoctions first to ensure safety or at least detect disaster before it reached the Lord's plate. One quirky tidbit: some kitchens had taster knights or servants whose sole job was to sample potentially poisoned dishes. Today we call it paranoia. In medieval times, it was dinner insurance. Imagine being paid to chew slowly, nod solemnly, and occasionally grimace. Historians still argue how widespread such roles were. Tasters only for royalty, or did even mid-level nobles employ them? Either way, the idea lingers. The more elaborate the feast, the greater the risk, and the more intricate the safeguards. Back in the hall, spices and presentation spoke louder than flavor alone. Exotic ingredients signaled trade networks spanning continents. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, sugar, all brought from distant lands, sometimes costing more than a month's wages for a peasant. You think back to the saffron and honey, the candied nuts, the marzipan beasts, and marvel that every bite carried the weight of oceans and deserts, caravan trails and ship decks. Even the tableware reflected status. Plates of pewter, silver, or even gold gleamed under torchlight, while common folk ate from trenchers or simple bowls. Food and vessel combined to create theatre. A bite of beef could signify wealth, power, and the Lord's reach across the known world. You picture a servant gingerly placing a slice of gilded pastry on a silver dish, performance layered atop. Consumption. The smells of that night linger in your imagination. Smoke from the hearth, the acrid temps of burnt grains, the sweetness of honey, the sharpness of spiced wine, all combine into a sensory memory that's simultaneously grotesque, fascinating, and oddly comforting. You realize that this is the essence of medieval dining, a blend of survival, ritual, spectacle, and social hierarchy, all simmering together in one massive, chaotic pot. By now, your eyelids are heavy, and the castle around you grows quiet, but you can still see the bustle of kitchens, the shuffle of feet, the gleam of polished dishes, the careful placement of a hedgehog-shaped meatball. In the stillness, the night whispers the truth of those centuries. Food was life, performance, and belief intertwined, and even the most disgusting dishes tell a story of human ingenuity and endurance. The cold night deepens, carrying with it a faint scent of herbs and smoke. and you find yourself wandering through the hall once more in your mind. Candles long since extinguished, the wooden benches empty, the echoes of laughter softened into memory. You imagine the leftover feast, crumbs on the table, a swan carcass propped like a trophy, the last of the spiced wine settling in darkened goblets. Even in absence, the spectacle lingers, as if the castle itself breathes the stories of those meals into the stones. And then you remember the people, the unseen participants, not the nobles who dazzled with exotic birds and gilded sugar, but the kitchen hands, the stable boys, the cleaners, the poor outside the walls. They lived the other side of every feast. One quirky tidbit: some servants would secretly eat scraps raw, hiding under tables, while others were tasked with grinding leftovers for livestock. Their lives revolved around the margins of the banquet, a shadow world that never made it into the chronicles. Historians still argue how much the lower classes benefited from leftovers. Was it generous charity or just survival? Either way, these scraps were lifelines, a reminder that feasting and famine often lived side by side in the medieval imagination. You drift past the memory of posset, ale, and hedgehog meat, and linger on simpler foods: bread, beans, barley, dried fruits. They are plain, modest, but steadfast. They carried people through winter, filled stomachs when spices ran out, and anchored the feasts that dazzled with spectacle. You realize, with a soft exhale, that survival and extravagance existed on the same table, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony. The wind brushes against the castle walls, whispering through cracks and arrow slits. Somewhere a dog stirs, sniffing at a discarded truss of meat. You picture it nosing through scraps of cabbage mush, or a leftover candied nut, finding sustenance in the chaos. There is a strange comfort in this continuity, the cycles of feasting and scavenging, of spectacle and survival, stretching across centuries. Your mind softens as you imagine the end of this long night. Torches gutter low, servants retreat, and the hall empties. The smells fade, the sounds dim, and all that remains is the memory of what once was. A night of imagination, indulgence, and survival, strange enough to fascinate and gentle enough to soothe when remembered. You lean back against the imagined stone wall of the castle, letting your body settle. The feasts, the food, the oddities, they were never just meals. They were stories, rituals, and lessons in humanity. And now, in the quiet, the story drifts toward its end. The air grows colder still, brushing against your skin as you imagine the castle gates slowly closing for the night. The hall behind you is empty, the echoes of chaos and laughter replaced by silence and shadow. You notice the faint scent of burned wood and honey lingering in corners, a reminder of the feast's intensity. It's strange to realize that something as grotesque as hedgehog-shaped meatballs or frog pies can leave a memory so tender, almost lullaby-like, when viewed from this quiet distance. And yet, it's not just the food that lingers, it's the atmosphere, the ritual, the human effort entwined with every dish. Servants still move silently in your imagination, mopping, stacking, and carrying away scraps. One quirky tidbit: in some castles, leftover sauces were carefully collected in jars for future use, seasoned anew to flavor the next meal. Nothing was wasted, and every drop had a purpose. You picture a servant scraping the last of a thick, spiced gravy from a trencher, smiling faintly at the thought that even in chaos, Something would endure. Historians still argue how far medieval kitchens went to preserve or reuse leftovers. Was it born of necessity, frugality, or an early sense of sustainability? Perhaps all three. Either way, the effort shows a world where every morsel, no matter how unappetizing, had significance. The night sky above the castle stretches deep and endless. Stars glitter like sugar dust scattered across velvet, reminding you of the distant lands from which spices traveled to reach the banquet table. Cinnamon, pepper, saffron, they arrived through perilous journeys, each grain carrying the weight of continents, merchants, and ships. The extravagance of the feast becomes even more astonishing when you consider its global connections. In the quiet, you remember the laughter, the toasts, the groans of overfull bellies, the peculiar textures of sticky honey, chewy bread, and jelly from hooves, once shocking, now soften in memory. You realize that the feast was not only about survival or display, it was about connection, connecting with others at the table, connecting with distant lands through ingredients, connecting with time itself through rituals that endure even centuries later. Your body relaxes fully now, leaning into the imagined stones of the courtyard. Every sensory echo of the feast smell, sound, texture, and taste drifts into a gentle hum. You are ready to let it go, to let the memory fold into sleep, and to let the night itself carry you toward rest. The castle's silhouette against the night sky feels softer now, less imposing, more like a friend who has guided you through a strange, sticky, and oddly fascinating evening. The memory of tables overflowing with gilded birds, hedgehog, meatballs, frog pies, and endless honeyed desserts has settled into a calm, almost whimsical hum. Even the most grotesque moments, the posset that curdled unexpectedly, the candied nuts that stuck stubbornly to your teeth, have taken on a surreal, gentle quality. Like a dream you half remember while sinking deeper into rest. You reflect on the rhythm of medieval life, the cadence of feast and fast, abundance and scarcity. One quirky tidbit drifts to your mind. In some courts, feasts were planned according to the lunar calendar. Certain dishes were reserved for specific moon phases, believed to influence digestion, temperament, or even fortune. You smile, imagining nobles peering at the sky and adjusting menus accordingly. A blend of superstition, ritual, and theatre shaping every bite. Historians still argue whether these astrological practices genuinely affected health or were merely symbolic performances. Either way, they offer a window into a world where food, faith, and the cosmos intertwined. Each dish served not just nourishment, but guidance, warning or blessing. The servants, the cooks, the stable hands, they all appear in your imagination now. A moving tapestry of lives often hidden behind the spectacle. Their work enabled the wonders and horrors of the banquet, yet they remained humble, diligent, and quietly indispensable. You feel a soft admiration for them, for the patience, ingenuity, and endurance that went into every odd concoction you've encountered tonight, even the smells. Once overpowering sour ale, boiled cabbage, roasted meats, honeyed desserts now feel like part of the night's lullaby. They mingle with the crisp night air, the faint scent of pine or herbs, carrying with them a history that is vivid yet comforting. Every aroma tells a story, each memory of taste, a gentle reminder of human creativity and resilience. You lean back, your body heavy but relaxed, and allow the castle, the courtyard, and the fading feast to fold into the background. The story has reached its penultimate pause. Tomorrow, the world will continue. But tonight, the echoes of laughter, chaos, and bizarre indulgence fade softly into the hum of quiet stars. The final edges of night stretch thin, soft and silver under the pale moon, and you feel the weight of your journey through the medieval banquet gently pressing you toward sleep. The images of gilded birds, hedgehog-shaped meatballs, frog pies, and sticky honey are no longer jarring. They are delicate memories, like pressed flowers tucked between the pages of a book. Each detail carries the hum of a world long past, yet somehow vibrant, tactile, and strangely comforting. You think of the tables cleared, the servants retreating, the leftover scraps nourishing those beyond the walls. The contrast between opulence and necessity becomes clear. Feasts were not only spectacle, but a testament to the cycle of life, the careful balance of abundance and frugality. One quirky tidbit lingers. Medieval kitchens sometimes brewed feast potions, mixtures of herbs, wine, and spices, believed to aid digestion after heavy meals. You smile, realizing that after the swan, the posset, and the gilded sweets, such a potion would have been most welcome. Historians still argue how effective these concoctions were, or if they functioned primarily as ritualistic reassurance. Either way, the intent matters, the desire to find balance, to soothe, and to honor the body after indulgence. You can imagine sipping a warm, spiced beverage, the weight of the feast gradually lifting as calm settles into your limbs. Your thoughts wander to the people who lived these meals, the nobles, the cooks, the servants, and the poor outside the castle walls. Each played a role in the story you've traced tonight. Each bite, each slice, each carefully or carelessly tossed dish tells a tale of survival, imagination, and human endeavor. The hall, though emptied, continues to hum in memory, a place where history and humanity collide. As the castle recedes in your mind, so does the intensity of the feast. You feel your body soften, your breath steady, the tension of surprise, disgust, and curiosity easing away. Outside, the night wind whispers through trees and stone, carrying with it the quiet hum of centuries past. And finally, the feast, both bizarre and illuminating, settles entirely into the soft shadows of memory. You lie back in imagination, the echoes fading, ready to drift into dreams untouched by cabbage, mush, or frog pies, carrying instead the quiet warmth of human stories and the gentle rhythm of history itself. And now, at last, the story softens into a gentle sigh. The castle, the hall, the tables piled high with every imaginable and sometimes unimaginable dish, all fade into the comforting shadows of memory. You've wandered through the strange and sticky, the sweet and sour, the whimsical and grotesque. You've imagined the clang of pots, the laughter and groans of full bellies, the careful work of servants, the spectacle of gilded birds, the rebellion of frogs, and the patient endurance of all who lived in this world of food as theatre. You feel your body sink further, heavy with imagined fullness, but light with wonder. Every dish carried a story of survival, of display, of faith, of superstition, and of human ingenuity. Even the most revolting meals now feel like notes in a lullaby, each one a brushstroke in the grand tableau of medieval life. You realize that feasts were never just about taste. They were about connection, creativity, and continuity. The night air is cool and still, brushing against your imagined skin. Stars prickle the sky above, silent witnesses to centuries of banquets, simple suppers, and shared meals. The smell of herbs, the warmth of fire, the echo of laughter all fold into one soft, fading hum. You exhale slowly, letting the sensations drift away, leaving only calm. Breathe, slowly, evenly. Let the memory of the feast settle into your mind like a book closing. Let the castle walls, the banquet tables, the aromas and textures all drift gently behind you. The story has ended. Your journey through medieval kitchens, banquets, and the bizarre world of culinary imagination is complete. Rest now, fully. The night holds you safely. Your mind and body soften, and sleep carries you toward gentle dreams, free from frogs, hedgehogs, and sticky honey.